They told us Berlin was predictable in winter. They lied. That morning in '83, I was 2 blocks from the wall, staring at a cup of coffee that tasted like old coins, waiting for a man who never showed. Instead, someone else walked in left. A brown envelope on the counter like it was nothing. No eye contact, no signal. Just an envelope heavier than it looked. Inside? A draft stamped Operatia, Sneg, Operation Snow. Whoever wrote it didn't plan on freezing a city, they planned on freezing the markets. And if you think wars are fought with guns, you've been reading the wrong history books. Before I regret saying any of this, hit that like button. Subscribe if this already feels uncomfortable. And tell me what city you're watching from, and what time it is. I like knowing where people still dare to listen to secrets like these. The cafe door stuck halfway, like it had swollen from the cold. I gave it a shove with my shoulder and stepped inside, shaking the snow off my coat. Berlin smelled the same, that winter-burnt coffee and damp wool. I took the table near the back, the one with the cracked formica surface and the Hun. Ashtray nobody bothered to empty. We were told cafes were safe, less formal than safe houses, but I never trusted a room with more than 2 exits. This one had 3. I noticed that right away. I ordered coffee I wouldn't drink and opened the paper like a man killing time. The rendezvous was supposed to be simple. A microfilm exchange, 20 seconds of small talk, and I'd be out the door before the sugar hit the bottom of the cup. My contact was late 10 minutes, then 15. That didn't happen in Berlin, unless someone was already in a trunk. I checked my watch for the 3rd time when the bell above the door rang. A man in a gray overcoat walked in, carrying nothing but a leather briefcase. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He left a brown envelope on the counter, muttered something to the waitress, and walked out like gravity worked differently for him. No one else seemed to care. The waitress slid the envelope onto the far end of the counter next to a chipped sugar bowl. For 5 minutes, nobody claimed it. 5 long minutes in a city where 5 seconds can get you killed. I told myself it wasn't my problem. Protocol said walk away. But then again, protocol never sat alone in a Berlin cafe while the snow turned the streets into mirrors. I stood, slow enough not to look like I had a reason, and walked to the counter. The paper felt heavier than it should, thick stock, sealed, with a strip of red wax that cracked like old bones when I broke it. Inside were 3 sheets typed on onion skin paper, the kind we used for drafts meant to disappear. At the top of the first page, Operatia Sneg, Operation Snow, no classification. Stamp, no routing codes, no signatures. Just a title and a plan written like someone didn't expect to live long enough to explain it. The words made less sense the more I read. Liquidity models, cross-border flows, terms even the agency's finance guys avoided unless they were drinking. Then one line hit like a gut punch. Phase 1. Destabilize. U.S. Treasury instruments through falsified certificates distributed via neutral entities. If this was real, it wasn't sabotage. It was economic warfare dressed like a bookkeeping error. I folded the papers back into the envelope, slid it inside my coat, and left enough cash on the table to pay for everyone's coffee. Outside, the cold bit like it had teeth. I walked east. Not west habit when you didn't want to be predictable. The snow muffled everything, even the sound of my own boots. Halfway down the block, I caught a reflection in a shop window. A man lighting a cigarette under a street lamp, his overcoat. Too clean for this neighborhood. I didn't need confirmation. The KGB wasn't subtle when they wanted you to know you were interesting. I turned the corner, heart steady, steps even. Never run in Berlin. Running made you pray dot by the time I reached the S-Bahn station. I decided 2 things. 1, the envelope wasn't meant for me. And 2, I was keeping it anyway. Call it curiosity. Call it survival. Same thing in this line of work. The train platform was nearly empty, just two drunks arguing in Polish and a woman with a stroller that looked older than she was. I kept my back to the wall and pretended to read the schedule. My reflection in. The glass doors stared back, same tired face, same gray at the temples, but now with an envelope that could start a storm no one would see coming as the train screeched in. I wondered if my contact was dead, or worse, compromised. Either way, someone wanted this plan in play, and someone else wanted it buried. I was in the middle, holding a secret big enough to crack the floor under Wall Street, and that should have been the end of it. But the man in the gray overcoat stepped onto the same train that the train lurched forward, throwing everyone a step off balance, including me. I caught the metal pole and glanced sideways. The man in the gray overcoat stood 2 cars down, pretending to read a newspaper that hadn't been printed in 2 years. That was Berlin for you. People carried props more than papers. I shifted the envelope deeper inside my coat and forced myself to breathe like a commuter, not a courier holding a detonator in the shape of 3 pages at Alexanderplatz. He didn't follow me off the train. That should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. Too clean an exit meant someone else would pick me up. They always did. Back at the hotel, I locked the door, placed the envelope under the radiator, and poured myself a drink I didn't want. The whiskey tasted of dust and bad decisions. I stared at the wall clock, an ugly brass thing left by the last government, and waited for the phone to ring. It took exactly 12 minutes. Wrong name, the voice said before I spoke. American accent, clipped. You weren't supposed to be there. Then the line went dead. I sat there, the receiver warm in my hand, feeling like I'd just been erased from something I didn't know. I was part of wrong name. They didn't even bother to call me by mine. That told me 2 things. First, the envelope wasn't an accident. Second, someone wanted to see what I'd do with it. I didn't like being tested. Not at this age. Not in this city. 2 hours later, a knock at the door. Not the light tap of housekeeping 3 hard raps. Official and impatient. I slid the Walther from under the bed and opened the door with the chain still on. A bellboy stood there, holding a message slip like it was radioactive. Herr Cooper? He asked, reading the name slowly, as if it tasted foreign. That wasn't my name. I tipped him, took the note, and shut the door. The note said, "Station doubts your version. Come in tonight. Use entrance C, no signature, no. Code words, just enough to get me killed if it was a setup. Langley trained us for everything except doubt from our own side." That was the part they left out of the manuals. I burned the note in the ashtray and watched the smoke curl like questions I didn't want answers to. Then I put on my coat and headed into the night, because that's what you do when you're already too deep. The CIA station sat behind a storefront that sold West German radios. I walked in, nodded to the clerk, and slipped through the back door, into the gray corridors where secrets went to rot. The air smelled of stale coffee and old maps. 2 men waited in the briefing room, both with the kind of faces you forget unless they're pulling the trigger. One of them slid a photo across the table. "This the man you were supposed to meet?" he asked. The photo showed a dead man in an alley, face swollen, eyes open like he'd seen the punchline. I nodded once. He was carrying nothing. The other said, "So where's the envelope?" I played dumb. "What envelope? Envelope?" They stared at me long enough to make the lie sweat on my skin. Finally, one of them leaned forward. "Your cover was Cooper. You're not Cooper. And now you're holding something that doesn't belong to you." It wasn't a question. I thought about the radiator back in the hotel room and the papers drying under it like pressed flowers. For the first time in years, I felt something close to fear, not because of what they knew, but because of what I'd already decided. If this was a loyalty test, I'd already failed. When I left the station that night, Berlin looked sharper, like someone had drawn the streets in ink instead of pencil. Every light felt like an interrogation lamp, every shadow like a hand reaching for my throat. I walked fast, not because I wanted to, but because I knew the man in the gray overcoat wouldn't be the last dot, and that should have been the end of it. But then I heard a woman's voice behind me, speaking perfect Russian, saying my real name. She said my name like it belonged to her, soft and sharp at the same time. I turned slowly, because in Berlin, you don't spin fast unless you want a bullet to find you. She was standing under a flickering street lamp, wearing a wool coat 2 sizes too big and gloves that didn't match. Her hair was tucked under a scarf, her eyes the color of bad weather. "Walk," she said, not asking. And I did, because sometimes control is an illusion and survival is knowing when you've lost it. We moved through the streets like ghosts. No words, just the echo of boots and the distant hum of a tram. She led me into an apartment above a bakery that smelled of burnt sugar and secrets. Inside, the heat was low and the windows were sealed with tape. Someone expected trouble. She unwrapped her scarf, sat by a table littered with papers and empty tea glasses, and finally spoke. "You read it? No point lying now." I nodded. Her face didn't change. "Then you know it's not theory. It's already moving." She pushed a folder across the table. Inside were diagrams of liquidity flows, banking institutions, offshore entities, and something else, false certificates of U.S. Treasury bonds, perfect replicas down to the watermark. I'd seen counterfeits before. These weren't counterfeits. These were ghosts designed to pass through every checkpoint like smoke, draining capital from real markets into black channels no one could trace. "They start with 1%, she said, her voice flat. "Enough to cause doubt, not panic. Then they move faster. Money runs when it smells fear. And America? It will smell like blood before spring." I kept my face still, but inside, every instinct screamed. If this worked, Wall Street wouldn't need bombs. It would collapse under the weight of its own trust. I flipped through the pages, noting the signatures, the precision. Whoever built this knew our system better than some of our own people. "Where'd they get this intel?" I asked. She smiled without humor. "Where do you think? Someone sold it to them, not rubles. Dollars. That sat between us like a loaded gun. Treason paid in green, and I was supposed to figure out who before. The whole house of cards fell. Why tell me?" I asked. "Because I'm not going back," she said. "And because they'll kill me before they kill you." She lit a cigarette and stared at the wall while I read. The plan wasn't elegant, it was brutal. Strike the trust chain. Break confidence in the instruments that held the American economy together. Panic would do the rest. No bombs, no troops. Just cascading failure until the White House was too busy patching holes to notice who drilled them. I closed the folder and slid it back, slow and deliberate. "You want out," I said. She nodded. "Then you give me names." She reached into her coat and laid a small notebook on the table. "These are intermediaries. Banks in Switzerland, Panama. They think they're laundering drug money. They're wrong." The list was short but heavy. 4 banks, coded transactions, all rooting through shadows long enough to make anyone disappear. But one detail hooked my eye. 2 entries for the same bank, identical amounts, just days apart. Sloppy or deliberate, I couldn't tell. And that bothered me. "You'll take me with you," she said suddenly. Not a question, a demand. I looked at her, really looked. She was younger than I thought, but her eyes were older than both of us put together. "You think I can promise that?" I said. "You don't promise. You decide," she replied, crushing. her cigarette in an empty glass. I slipped the notebook into my coat. No protest from her. That told me everything. She was betting on me because she had no one else left. Outside, the city groaned under the weight of snow and lies. I walked her to the door and told her to wait for my signal. Back on the street, I felt the cold bite through the wool, sharper than before. The envelope in my pocket was heavy, but the notebook was heavier. Somewhere between those pages and those faces, there was a truth no one wanted to own, and that should have been the end of it. But 2 blocks later, I saw the man in the gray, overcoat leaning against a black Volga, and he wasn't alone. The Volga didn't follow me. It just sat there like a black question mark under the street lamp. 2 men smoking, one staring too long, the other pretending not to. I didn't change my pace, didn't look twice. In Berlin, you never acknowledge the hunter. You just keep moving like you don't smell the blood dot by the next morning. I had 2 new priorities: move the girl somewhere safe and verify the notebook. The first part failed before it started. When I called the bakery flat, no one answered. Either she'd moved fast or someone moved faster. I didn't have time to wonder which. The second part took me to a building I'd hoped to avoid, the Reichsbank branch in East Berlin. Officially, it was a relic of a divided economy. Unofficially, whispers said the KGB had carved out a whole floor to run operations too sensitive for Moscow. Documents, logistics, money flows, anything that required silence and precision. I wore a gray suit and a tired face, the kind of look clerks saw every day. The archivist was waiting in the lobby, a thin man with a stoop and eyes that darted like birds. His name was Dieter, and I'd known him long enough to trust him only as far as his debts allowed, which, lucky for me, wasn't far at all. "Didn't tell me what you're looking for," he said as we walked toward the elevators, his voice a nervous whisper. "That's because you don't want to know," I replied. He didn't argue. People rarely do when the alternative is a cell. The elevator groaned to life, climbing slow, like it regretted every floor. When the doors opened on 4, the air changed drier, colder, carrying the faint chemical smell of paper treated to last longer than the men who filed it. The corridor stretched straight and silent, lit by bulbs that hummed like they were keeping secrets. Dieter led me to a door with no number. Inside was a room lined with shelves, each holding ledgers, bound in cracked leather. A desk sat in the middle, its surface too clean for a room that claimed to be forgotten. That was the first sign this wasn't just an archive. 10 minutes, Dieter said, glancing at his watch. His hands trembled slightly, like a man who'd seen enough trouble to know it was contagious. I opened the first drawer and froze. Certificates. Perfect, gleaming, stamped and sealed like they'd come straight from the U.S. Treasury. Except they hadn't. They couldn't have. Every watermark, every serial number, flawless. Except one thing, the dates. Some were months ahead. Instruments that didn't even exist yet. Already manufactured, ready to flood markets that didn't know they were rigged. Behind me, Dieter cleared his throat. "You got what you need?" he asked, too quickly. I turned and saw sweat on his collar despite the cold. That told me something. He knew what this was, and he knew who else might come looking. "Give me the keys," I said. He hesitated. I stepped closer. "You owe me, Dieter." His shoulders sagged like paper under rain. He handed me the ring dot in the cabinet by the far wall. I found what I hadn't known I was looking for. A logbook, neat columns of entries, initials, and codes. Some matched the notebook from the girl. Some didn't. But one detail made my stomach tighten. A U.S. bank name I recognized. Listed twice, with transfers big enough to buy a country. Dates circled in red pencil, like someone wanted to make sure the point wasn't missed. I snapped 2 photos with the Minex in my pocket and slid. the logbook back just as the door handle turned. Voices in the hall, Russian, low and clipped. Dieter's face went white. "Window," I whispered. He shook his head. "4th floor," he stammered. "Then start praying," I said, moving fast. The window latch was stiff, but fear makes you strong. Cold air rushed in as boots hit the corridor tiles. I slipped out first, gripping the ledge, concrete biting into my palms. Dieter hesitated, then followed, his breath ragged like torn paper. From inside came the sound of the door swinging. Open, a pause, then voices snapping orders. I didn't need to understand the words. I already knew what they meant. We edged along the ledge toward the fire escape, the city spread below like a map. No one asked us to read. I didn't look down. You don't, not when the only way is forward. That should have been the end of it. But when we reached the alley, Dieter was gone, and so was the logbook. Snow fell heavier the next day, thick enough to mute the city like someone turned the volume down on Berlin. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth, the kind that comes from bad dreams or worse whiskey. Dieter was gone, and so was the logbook. That didn't surprise me. Men like him don't risk their necks for long, unless they plan to cash out, before the rope tightens. What worried me was that someone let him live long enough to run. That meant the book was worth more alive than dead, at least for now. I dressed in silence, checked the Minox in my pocket, and pulled out the notebook the girl had given me. The same 4 banks stared back in coded letters, clean handwriting. No smudges. A perfectionist wrote this, and perfectionists make mistakes when they think no one's watching. The duplicate entry bothered me, same bank, same amount, 2 days apart. Sloppy or deliberate? In my world, nothing was sloppy dot by noon. I was in a phone booth near Alexanderplatz. The glass fogged from my breath, dialing a number that wasn't supposed to exist. Langley rooted through 3 countries before the line clicked. "Report," a voice said. No hello, no name. "I need clearance to follow a financial lead," I said, keeping it flat. "What lead?" "Swiss intermediaries, maybe Panama. Possibly inside cooperation. I'll need a green card." There was a pause long enough to make me sweat under my collar. Then, negative. "Your cover's compromised. Hand over the material and await exfil." I laughed, a short dry sound. "If I do that, you'll be cleaning rubble off Wall Street in 6 months. Another pause. This one colder. "That's not your call." The line went dead. I stared at the receiver, feeling the weight of what wasn't said. "You're expendable. You've always been expendable." I slipped out of the booth and into the snow, collar up, coat tight, mind racing. If the agency wanted me out, it wasn't because they didn't believe me. It was because they believed me too much. And that meant the plan wasn't just a Soviet dream. It was real. It was already moving. The Swiss lead pulled me west, toward a banker whose name came up twice in the girl's notebook. A man who smiled in photographs and laundered sins for breakfast. Getting close meant using an old contact. The kind of fixer who survived by pretending loyalty was a currency he never spent. We met in the back of a shuttered cinema, the screen ripped, the seats collecting dust like secrets no one came back. "For, you look tired," he said, grinning like a fox. "You look expensive," I replied, handing him a packet of Deutschmarks. His grin widened. He slid a folder across the seat between us. Inside were telex copies, transaction trails, routing, numbers that danced like shadows across half the globe. Swiss banks, Panamanian shells, even a Korean outfit I'd heard rumors about in '79. But then I saw it, the same U.S. bank from the logbook, appearing twice, wired through 2 different names, but landing in the same account. Not laundering, not profit, positioning. A financial Trojan horse waiting to crack open at the right moment. Who runs the account? I asked. He shrugged. Some analyst stateside. Quiet type. Likes numbers more than people. Name. He wrote it on a scrap of paper and slid it over. I read it twice slow because the letters didn't make sense in this context. They belonged to someone I'd seen before, someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this game. By the time I left the cinema, the snow had turned to slush, gray and mean under the street lamps. I walked fast, the name burning in my pocket. Like a match. The pieces were aligning into a shape I didn't like. A Soviet plan with American fingerprints. And if that name was real, then someone in Washington wasn't just watching, they were steering. Back in the hotel, I locked the door, drew the curtains, and laid everything out on the bed. The photos from the Reichsbank, the girl's notebook, the fixer's telex copies. Together, they told a story nobody wanted to read. A story where collapse wasn't an accident, but a design. I poured a drink, hands steady, mind anything but. Outside, the city kept breathing its cold, secret breath. I stared at the name again, let it sink in until it tasted like iron. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I swore I'd never call. The voice on the other end said one word, report, and that should have been the end of it. But before I spoke, I heard laughter in the background, and it was a laugh I knew from Langley. The voice on the line didn't wait for me to speak. You're burning daylight, Cooper, it said, using a name I'd stopped answering to 2 days ago. Then came the click of a lighter, the drag of a cigarette, and that laugh again, soft, amused, like this was all part of a game he'd already won. Put him on, I said. My throat was dry, but my voice came out steady. Another pause, then a shuffle, and there it was. A tone I hadn't heard in years, smooth as polished glass. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. No name, but I didn't need one. I knew that voice from the training rooms in Langley, back when the walls smelled of chalk and sweat and lies packaged as patriotism. He'd taught us how to survive in cities like this. Taught us to see patterns, read faces, trust nothing. And now he was sitting at the other end of a line I should never have dialed. You've been busy, he continued. A little too busy. I didn't answer. Words were landmines now, and I'd already stepped on enough. He sighed like a father disappointed in a son. We should talk in person. Bring what you have. 4C. Then the line went dead. 4C. It meant the fourth floor of a building most people thought was boring. The Bank for International Settlements satellite office in West Berlin. Neutral ground, at least on paper. In reality, it was a chessboard, where both sides pretended the rules mattered. I went armed, of course, but the real weapon was the notebook in my pocket. Getting in was easy too easy. The clerk at the desk didn't even look at my badge. That told me everything. Someone had cleared me in advance. Someone with reach. The elevator hummed up 4 floors, slow enough to make me feel every second. When the doors opened, the carpet smelled of money and old cigarettes. Room 4C was at the end of the corridor, its door polished, its brass number gleaming like a medal in the wrong uniform. I knocked once and stepped inside. He was there, behind a desk bigger than some Berlin apartments. Same face, just older hair thinner, jaw softer, but the eyes sharp enough to cut glass. He smiled like this was a reunion and not an interrogation. Sit, he said. I didn't. You trained us to trust no one, I said. Guess I should have listened. His smile didn't break. Trust was never the point. Alignment was. He poured 2 drinks from a crystal decanter and slid one toward me. I didn't touch it. What's the play? I asked. He leaned back, folding his hands like a man about to deliver scripture. The play, he said slowly, is survival. Ours, not theirs. You think the Soviets invented this? They're just students. We wrote the syllabus. The words. hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. I felt the floor tilt under me, the neat columns of loyalty and enemy and mission sliding into a gray blur. "You're telling me this is ours?" "I'm telling you," he said. "Markets are weapons now. Always have been. You just never read that chapter." I laughed once, bitter and low. "And Wall Street? What happens when it burns?" He shrugged, casual as a man discussing the weather. "Fire clears the rot. Sometimes you need collapse to control the rebuild. Better us than them?" There it was, the truth I didn't want and couldn't unhear. Operation Snow wasn't just a Soviet plot. It was a blueprint both sides were willing to color in, as long as the ink bled the right way. "Hand me the notebook," he said softly. Not a threat, not a request, just gravity pulling the inevitable. I looked at the leather cover, worn at the edges, warm from my coat pocket. Every instinct told me to slide it across the desk and walk out alive. But instinct wasn't running the show anymore. I slipped the notebook back into my coat. His eyes narrowed. Just a flicker, but enough. "Careful," he said. "You're starting to look like a liability." I opened the door without answering. The corridor stretched long and silent, every step echoing like a countdown, and that should have been the end of it. But when I hit the street, there was a car waiting, engine running, and a silhouette in the back seat that wasn't his Dot. The car didn't move right away. Just sat there, engine humming, exhaust curling into the cold air like a warning. The back window was tinted, but I didn't need a clear view to know whoever sat inside wasn't here for small talk. I kept walking, slow and steady, the way you do when you're trying not to look hunted. Half a block later, the door clicked open. "Get in," a voice said. Calm, male, carrying the kind of confidence you can't fake. I didn't break stride. That's how you get killed hesitating between yes and no. So I slid in, closing the door behind me. Inside smelled like leather and fear. A man in a dark coat sat in the corner, hands resting on a briefcase like it was alive. He nodded once, nothing friendly about it, then rapped twice on the glass. The driver pulled away, tires whispering over the wet street. "You've made this complicated," the man said, not looking at me. His voice was colder than the night outside. "We could have contained it." "Define contained," I said. My tone was dry, but my pulse wasn't. He opened the briefcase with a quiet snap and slid a folder across the seat. "You like reading. Here's something new." I hesitated, then opened it. Inside were 50 pages of calculations, graphs, and forecasts, an economic autopsy written before the patient was dead. The heading at the top read Projected Impact Analysis, Phase 3. Whoever wrote it wasn't guessing. They'd mapped everything. Liquidity drains, market confidence spirals, contagion timelines, all of it built on assumptions too precise to be theory. The details sank in like poison. Within 6 months of initiation, major U.S. indices would drop by 40%. Treasury yields would spike beyond historical ceilings. Dollar credibility would fracture, rippling through trade agreements like cracks in ice. And then came the kicker. Secondary effect-targeted bank failures, triggering systemic risk perception. I closed the folder slowly, feeling the car sway as it turned another corner. "You're telling me this isn't speculation?" He finally looked at me, eyes dark as the glass behind him. "I'm telling you it's already been tested. Small scales, quiet places." The words sat between us like a corpse. I thought of the duplicate entries, the Swiss accounts, the same names appearing like fingerprints at a crime scene no one admitted existed. How far along? I asked. He didn't blink. Far enough that pulling out would cost more than finishing. That's when I saw it, the single sheet clipped to the back of the folder. A name in bold, stamped with clearance codes I'd seen only twice in my life. It belonged to someone in Washington. Someone sitting so high they didn't breathe the same air as people like me. "Why show me this?" I asked. He leaned back, folding his hands like a priest offering last rites. "Because you're already dead on paper. Thought you deserved context before it gets literal." The car slowed, easing toward the curb. He took the folder back, snapping. The briefcase shut with finality. "Walk away, tonight, or you'll end up a footnote in a file no one reads." The door opened, cold air rushing in like a slap. I stepped out without a word. The car pulled away, taillights bleeding into the fog, leaving me on a street it felt emptier than a grave. I walked until my legs burned, replaying every word, every graph, every projection etched into my head. They weren't planning collapse, they were managing it, like arsonists timing the wind. And somewhere in those numbers was the truth nobody wanted spoken aloud. The Cold War wasn't just fought in alleys and embassies. It was fought in margins, decimals, and signatures that could topple empires without a single shot fired. Back in the hotel, I locked the door and poured a drink with hands that didn't feel like mine. The whiskey burned going down, but it didn't burn enough. On the table lay the only thing keeping me alive, the notebook. I opened it again, tracing the names like scars, and that should have been the end of it. But then I noticed something I'd missed before. A set of initials scribbled in the corner of the last page, initials that matched the man who taught me everything I know. The initials stared back at me like a whisper I couldn't unhear. Same handwriting style I'd memorized years ago on training reports, the kind he graded in red ink when I was still green enough to believe in clean wars. It confirmed what I'd started to fear. This wasn't betrayal from the outside. It was orchestration from the inside. The phone rang at 2:13. Calls at that hour never bring good news. Only orders you wish you hadn't answered. I let it ring twice, then picked up. No greeting, just a flat voice with an accent ironed out. "By too many years in Virginia. You're going to clean this up," it said. "How dirty are we talking?" I asked, though I already knew. All of it. Notes, negatives, anything that can breathe outside this room. And the girl? A pause long enough to tell me they'd already decided. Collateral. I felt something shift in my chest, quiet and final, like a door closing on air. "Why me?" I asked. "You've been inside. You know the rooms." "You're deniable." The line went dead before I could laugh at that last word. Deniable. That's what we all were. From Langley to Lubyanka, ghosts in coats, playing house. With nations that swore we didn't exist. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the curtains, bleeding pale light from a city that never really slept. The assignment was suicide dressed as duty. Infiltrate the KGB site again. Pull the negatives. Erase every trace of the operation. And maybe, if I played fast and quiet, die in a hallway nobody would bother mopping. But here's what they didn't factor in. I wasn't playing for them anymore. Not after the car. Not after the briefcase full of forecasts that read like a slow-motion obituary for the global economy. You spend enough years watching the board, and you start to wonder who's really moving the pieces. This time, I wasn't about to let them sweep me off by dawn. I had a plan, not a good one. Just one that let me keep my name from being a line in a black ledger. I stripped my kit down to the essentials. Lockpicks, a silenced Walther, 2 rolls of microfilm, and the Minix that had already become my insurance policy. Then I slid the notebook inside a sealed pouch and taped it to the small of my back. It was the only truth left, and if I had to crawl out on fire, it was coming with me. The Reichsbank loomed gray against the morning haze, its windows like dead eyes staring down at the city. Getting in was easier than last time, too easy. And that told me something ugly. They wanted me in. Maybe to finish their cleanup. Maybe to make sure the story ended right here, under fluorescent lights and polished floors. The fourth floor smelled the same paper and chemicals, the perfume of bureaucrats who thought ink could outlast bullets. The drawers were empty now, cabinets gutted like someone had carved the soul out of the building overnight. But in the corner, behind a curtain that didn't quite reach the floor, I found a metal case stamped with Cyrillic letters I didn't need to read to understand. Inside were the negatives, hundreds of frames, each one a nail in a coffin no one would admit existed. Charts, memos, signatures from men who smiled for cameras in daylight while drafting economic warfare in the dark. I loaded them into my bag, heart steady, ears tuned for the sound that kills. Boots on tile, doors breathing open. I heard it just as I clicked the case shut, a soft scuff, then another. Two voices in Russian, low and bored, like men guarding a door they didn't think would open. I moved fast, slipping down the corridor toward the service stairwell, the bag cutting into. My shoulder-like gilt dot at the bottom of the stairs. I stopped. Because if I left now, if I ran, the evidence would vanish into another archive, another vault, another lie. And I was tired of being part of lies. So I did the one thing they never trained us for. I walked out the back door with everything they told me to burn, and I didn't look back. Berlin was waking up when I hit the street. Cold air slapping my face like a warning I didn't need. I kept walking, one block, then another, until the city thinned and the silence felt safe enough to breathe, and that should have been the end of it. But hours later, when I opened the bag in the hotel room, half the negatives were missing, half the negatives gone. Not misplaced, not lost, removed by someone who knew exactly what mattered. The case had been clean when I grabbed it, no sign of tampering, which meant it happened while I was moving through the stairwell, when my hands were busy and my ears were listening for footsteps instead of whispers. That narrowed the suspects down to one group, the people who wanted me alive just long enough to finish their dirty work. I spread what I had left across the bed like a deck of poisoned cards. The images were sharp, precise, merciless. Tables of liquidity projections, risk models, cash flow disruptions, plotted like battle strategies. But then came something worse. A single-page photographed in poor light, grainy but legible, titled Comparative Stress Response Patterns, 1929 versus Phase Model. I froze. The charts weren't just academic, they were forensic. Someone had dissected the 1929 collapse and rebuilt it as a template, adjusting for new instruments, modern markets, faster flows of capital. Every pivot point, every trigger, mapped against current positions like history, being rehearsed for an encore. You want to know the part that kept me staring until my eyes burned? The annotations. Margin notes in neat Cyrillic script, drawing arrows between Great Depression data points and projected Phase 3 impacts. It wasn't just mimicry. It was mastery. They weren't copying history. They were improving on it, and that raised the myth. Question that chewed through my skull like acid. Had 1929 been an accident at all? Or had someone, decades ago, already understood how fear multiplies faster than any market correction? Because if that idea was true, then every economic disaster I'd been taught to see as natural might have been engineered. And maybe, just maybe, the Cold War wasn't the start of financial warfare. It was the sequel. I needed answers, and the only lead left was a set of initials scribbled on two separate negatives. The same as before, the ones tied to my old instructor. He wasn't a ghost in this story, he was the architect. Which meant this wasn't about East versus West anymore. It was about control, about who got to hold the detonator when money turned into a weapon sharper than any blade. I made the call from a payphone in a grocery store, the kind of place nobody remembers being in. When the line clicked, I skipped. The formalities. How long have you been running this? I asked. A pause, then the voice I knew too well. Calm, amused, like we were still in a classroom in Langley, and I was the kid who finally caught on. "Long enough," he said. "Since." 29? He chuckled, low and bitter. "Oh, you sweet bastard. You think history writes itself?" I gripped the receiver until my knuckles ached. "Who signed off?" "Everyone who matters," he said, "and none of the people who vote." The silence after that wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with truths I didn't want and couldn't give back. "You could have told me," I said finally. "No," he replied, almost gently, "because then you'd be me." The line went dead. I walked out into the street, the cold cutting through my coat like knives. Berlin's lights blurred in the fog, neon signs glowing like false promises. For the first time, I realized the war wasn't about land or ideology. It was about architecture, the kind built with zeros and decimals. And I'd been a bricklayer in a wall I never saw coming. Back in the room, I packed what was left of the evidence into 2 envelopes. One I'd keep, one I'd send somewhere even the agency couldn't bleach. It wouldn't stop the plan, but maybe it would scar it. Sometimes that's all you can do, leave a mark big enough for someone else to trip over later. I slid the second envelope under the lining of my suitcase, zipped it up slow, and sat on the bed staring at the door. Because sooner or later, someone was going to walk through it, and they wouldn't be bringing flowers, and that should have been the end of it. But when I stepped outside at dawn, the newsstands were already screaming about a technical correction, rattling U.S. markets, and I knew it wasn't technical at all. The wall fell in slow motion, at least from where I was standing. Berlin. In '89 wasn't fireworks and champagne for me. It was noise layered over silence. A city tearing itself open while men like me tried to vanish into the cracks. I had 2 envelopes left by then, one hidden under the lining of a suitcase I never checked, the other locked in a deposit box 3 countries away. I carried them like rotten teeth you can't pull, waiting for the infection to spread. When the first hammer hit concrete, I was in a safe house off Friedrichstrasse, listening to the radio cough out reports like confessions. East crossing west, borders dissolving like sugar in black coffee. And with every cheer outside, the phone on the table felt heavier, waiting to drag me back in. It rang at 3:12. Of course it did. "Berlin's done," the voice said. "American, clipped, efficient. Bring what you have. Committee wants full disclosure." Committee. The word tasted like bleach. I knew what it meant. A room with no windows, men in gray suits pretending to argue while deciding what never makes it to daylight. I thought about saying no, about burning the evidence and disappearing into some place where names didn't matter. But ghosts like me don't retire. We just orbit until someone calls us back to crash. The meeting happened in a building that used to belong to someone else, a ministry, a bureau, some office where paper pushed lives into graves. The hall smelled like dust and wet coats. I sat at a table under a light too bright for comfort, the envelopes stacked in front of me like silent verdicts. The man across from me wore glasses, thick enough to hide the lack of eyes behind them. He opened the first envelope, skimmed the pages, then slid them into a folder, stamped with a code I'd never seen. No questions about the missing negatives. No acknowledgement of what was in his hands. Just that bureaucratic calm I hated more than any interrogator's rage. When he was done, he sealed the folder, pressed a stamp into red wax, and dropped it into a metal cabinet. Classified, irrelevant. One word to bury 10 years of ghosts. "You did your job," he said. Like a priest granting absolution no one asked for. I stood, slow enough to make it feel like defiance, and walked out without a handshake. The corridor stretched long and empty, every door shut tight, every lock humming with secrets that would never see air. Outside, Berlin was drunk on freedom, Kids hammering walls that held more than concrete. I wanted to tell them the truth that walls don't fall, they just move. From streets to ledgers, from borders to balance sheets. But they wouldn't have listened. Nobody ever does until the fire hits their own roof. That night, in a rented room overlooking the river, I burned the last copy of the negatives. Watched the edges curl, ink blister, data turning into gray ghosts rising toward a ceiling stained with other people's smoke. It should have felt like closure. It didn't. It felt like erasing fingerprints from a gun that would still fire long after I was gone. When the last page turned to ash, I poured a drink and stared at my reflection in the window. Outside, fireworks cracked against the sky like cheap gunfire. People cheering for a new world while I sat there, holding the silence of the old one. I thought the game was over. I was wrong. Years passed like smoke thick enough to choke on, but gone before you could hold it. By the mid-90s, I'd turned into what we all become when the phone stops ringing. A man pretending he chose silence. A rented house near Lisbon. A passport with the wrong birth year. Nights spent listening to radios crackle with other people's problems. I told myself I was done with codes and corridors. I lied. It started with a headline buried in the finance section of an English language paper. Liquidity shock ripples across Southeast Asia. At first glance, it looked like any other crisis story. Currency slides, investors spooked, governments scrambling to plug holes in ships they didn't know were sinking. But the language was wrong, too technical, too precise. I'd seen those words before. Phase triggers, contagion thresholds, liquidity bleed. They weren't journalism. They were borrowed from a playbook I'd risked my life to stop. I read the article twice, then 3 times, fingers leaving sweat on the thin newsprint. The names of the affected banks clawed at the back of my memory. Not exact matches, but cousins of the same beasts I'd hunted in Berlin shell fronts, quiet intermediaries, jurisdictions where daylight was optional. I needed confirmation, and old habits die slow. Within a week, I was sitting in a hotel lobby in Singapore, the air thick with perfume and false promises, watching a television screen scroll numbers like dying heartbeats. Currencies free falling, markets convulsing, pundits preaching calm. In voices that betrayed panic. They called it an Asian contagion. I called it déjà vu. That night, I met an old fixer at a bar by the river, the kind of place where secrets flow smoother than whiskey. He didn't look surprised to see. Mean men like him never are. Surprise is how you get buried. You've been gone a long time, he said, counting the zeros on my retainer before finishing his drink. Not long enough, I replied, sliding a list across the table. Bank codes, transaction chains, corporate. Shells that smelled like ghosts. He came back 2 days later with a folder fat enough to break spines. Inside were telexes, memos, digital scraps pieced together like bones from a shallow grave. And there it was, the pattern I prayed I wouldn't find. Not exact, but close enough to feel like someone mocking me from across an ocean. Same triggers. Same cascading failure points. Same precision that looked like chaos to anyone who didn't know where to look. But here's what froze the blood in my veins. The annotations. Not Cyrillic this time. English. Clean, sharp, bureaucratic. Whoever ran this wasn't quoting a stolen plan, they were refining it. I sat on the edge of a hotel bed at 3 a.m. Neon bleeding through the curtains. Folder open like a wound. This wasn't a relic of the Cold War crawling out of its grave. It was evolution. A virus changing hosts, wearing new skins while everyone else kept fighting the last war. I thought about the committee in Berlin, about the folder stamped irrelevant, about the men in gray who told me markets were weapons now. They'd been right. The battlefield had shifted east, and the architects were still building, maybe the same hands, maybe new ones holding the same blueprints. I should have walked away, closed the folder, poured a drink, and let the world drown in numbers it couldn't pronounce. But I couldn't, because buried in those memos, half hidden under coded initials, was a name I hadn't heard in over a decade, a name that tied everything back to that bright office on the 4th floor in Berlin. I packed before sunrise, leaving the curtains open so the city could watch me go. The next flight out was full of bankers with hollow smiles and briefcases heavier than sins. I fit right in. For a moment, I almost believed I was ahead of the storm. But storms don't wait, they circle. And this one was already humming in the wires, spreading faster than truth. I told myself it wasn't personal anymore. I should have known better. I'm old now. The kind of old where mornings taste like metal and every joint feels like a classified file someone forgot to archive. Most men my age keep photo albums on their shelves. I keep a steel box under the floorboards, sealed so tight it sweats when the seasons change. Inside, fragments of a life built on whispers, negatives curling at the edges, notes scrawled in a hand I barely recognize as mine, and one envelope I never mailed. The television glows in the corner, sound low, images rolling like ghosts in color. Markets in free fall. Headlines screaming cyberatic cripples global banking network. The anchors keep saying unprecedented, like that word erases the patterns. But I see them lines, flows, timing so familiar it tastes bitter. It's not new. It's not chaos. It's choreography. The same architecture I bled to bury, dressed in code instead of paper. I shuffle to the box, knees cracking like old floors, and pry it open. The air inside smells of dust and old ink. The notes are still there, pages browned, corners soft, numbers. That meant everything once and nothing to the men cashing in on fear now. I spread them across the table like a priest laying out relics for a dying faith. Maybe that's what this is, a ritual for ghosts. I traced the initials on the last page, the same ones that haunted me through Berlin alleys and Asian skylines. He's long dead, they told me. Maybe they were right. Or maybe men like him never die. They just change form, slip into systems until their names become code and their ideas hung under every decimal in every machine. On the screen, a reporter talks about digital contagion, about liquidity shocks rippling through markets like a virus. I almost laugh, except my throat's too dry. We saw this coming before some of these kids were born. We wrote scenarios, ran simulations, warned the people who swore they'd control it. And now they look surprised. They shouldn't be. Collapse. Doesn't surprise anyone who ever tried to build it. I pick up the envelope, heavy with something I never had the guts to release, a full dossier, cleaner than memory, louder than confession. It could still matter if someone knew what to do with it. But the world's deaf now, tuned to the hum of screens and numbers they think mean life. They don't. They mean leverage. I sit back, listening to the radiator hiss like an old enemy breathing in the corner. My hands tremble, not fear, just age, but I steady them long enough to slide the papers back into the box. Lock it. Hide it under the boards where silence feels permanent. It isn't, of course. Nothing is. Outside, the night presses against. The window, thick and black, swallowing the lights of a city that learned nothing. Somewhere out there, men with clean shoes and dirty hands are rewriting the playbook for the 100th time. And somewhere inside me, a voice I thought I buried, whispers that I should have done more. Maybe that's true. Maybe I was just another moving part, spinning until the gears stripped and left me useless. I pour a drink, the last from a bottle older than the anchors on TV. The glass sweats in my hand, and for a second, I almost believe this is just another bad night. Then the screen flickers, charts bleeding red like open wounds, and I know better. This wasn't the last chapter. It was just the pause before the next panic. And somewhere in the margins of history, my fingerprints are still there. I killed the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the city breathe through cracked windows. The steel box rested under the floorboards like a heart that refused to stop beating. Outside, sirens wailed thin, distant, pointless against the hum of systems eating themselves alive. I lit one last cigarette and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling, slow and aimless, like the years I lost chasing ghosts no one wanted to name. Maybe tomorrow I'll burn what's left. Or maybe I'll leave it for some poor bastard to find and think he's uncovered a secret. The truth? There are no secrets. Just debts rolling forward, collecting interest in blood and trust. The screen in the corner glowed one last time before I pulled the plug. Quiet at last, but not peace. Never peace. Before I vanish for real. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you've made it this far into the dark. And tell me, what city are you watching from? And what time is it where you are?